Thanks for your patience. Your listenership is very important to us. You have been waiting for 504 hours. You are next in line, the host of Prove It To Me. We'll be with you in approximately 1 minute. Please stay on the line. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Prove It To Me. I'm your host, Dr. Matt Law. Yes, I know I'm late again. If you've listened to this podcast before, you know I have a disclaimer that explains that this podcast is completely separated from my employment with any of the entities for whom I work. As such, sometimes my regular employment requires me to be cut off from the ability to perform any other work for anyone else for a certain period of time. Now, that's a nice way of saying I went into the field and did Marine shit as a naval officer for about a week. Anyway, when I do get cut off from everything else, I get a little backlogged on the other things I need/want to accomplish. So here we are. I truly do appreciate your patience. Now, on the last episode, we looked at scare tactics used in workplace safety and health training. We discussed some of the things I normally bring up in the ethics course I co-teach, and we looked at 4 different studies that critically evaluated the use of scare tactics to influence behaviors in a variety of applications. One of those studies was this weird critical multimodal discourse analysis dealing with semiotics, which I still haven't quite figured out how to properly evaluate. The other 3, however, quantitatively showed that the scare tactics used in their study were not working as intended. We learned a few key points in part 1, but one of the most important things was this extended parallel process model, which illustrates the relationship between scare tactics, which are also known as fear appeals or threat appeals, and behavior outcomes. Importantly, though, this model illustrates that efficacy makes or breaks that relationship. Based on this model, you have to thoroughly scare the shit out of the person receiving the message so they feel the threat is severe enough and they are susceptible enough to the threat. Then, you have to also make sure that efficacy exists for the person receiving the message. Remember, efficacy requires response efficacy, which means the person receiving the message believes the recommended behavior will reduce the threat, and it also requires self-efficacy, which means the person believes they are capable of doing the recommended behavior. For example, let's pick on driver safety because that's an easy one to pick on. Let's say I trained a driver and used all of these gruesome photos and videos to show them the severity of accidents when they occur. Honestly, I didn't even have to dig real hard to find those, right? Then I trained the driver how to drive safely. You know, don't speed, stay aware, don't run red lights, don't text and drive, do hands-free calling, all of that stuff. Let's assume the driver now feels that the outcome of an accident is pretty severe. They know they are susceptible to an accident and they know what behaviors they need to do to avoid it. Now, cut to 6 weeks later, that driver is in Florida, where on a 70-mile-per-hour interstate, traffic goes at 2 speeds, 60 miles per hour in the left lane, and yes, I said the left lane, or 80 to 90 miles per hour everywhere else. The driver no longer feels that 70 miles per hour is a feasible speed, so they decide to join the 80 to 90 group. Self-efficacy for not speeding, gone. Then, a text comes in. It's urgent. The driver feels like they need to respond. The driver believes they can send the text real quick without any negative impact. Why? They've been doing it every day because the job demands it, and so far, nothing bad has happened. Also, no one trained them on how to use hands-free texting. Response efficacy, gone. And without efficacy, those scare tactics are no longer affecting the desired behavior. So, theoretically, it takes all of these things for scare tactics to work. If you ask me, That's a lot of shit to manage while you insist on using your graphic images and videos in your safety training. Oh, and also, this model explains that fear without efficacy can actually exacerbate the problem. People will adopt fear control processes, resulting in defensive avoidance. The outcome you want is danger control processes, meaning you want them to be focused on controlling the hazard rather than controlling their own fear. Now remember, I say theoretically because this is a model, and models don't tell us the way things work. Models tell us which relationships to measure to determine if things are working. However, on the last episode, we went through 3 different studies that each mentioned this model, and I'm sure there are certainly more studies out there that measure against this model. By the way, you realize these researchers are doing the Lord's work, right? How many of you out there are just creating and delivering your safety trainings and never really measuring outcomes after the fact? And I'm not talking about your little post-training quiz that measures knowledge retention immediately after the training. I'm talking about measuring the stuff that matters and drawing correlations. Look, all I'm saying is that if you're going to continue using scare tactics, you better be prepared to measure the outcomes. If you don't measure it, you can't manage it. Until you do, you can't swear to me that it works. I just went through a bunch of research that quantitatively states that it probably doesn't. And if you really wanted it to, there's some extra steps that I bet you haven't bothered to take. Now also, only one of those studies really talked about the span of time that the scare tactics they were studying influence behaviors, which was partially why I started this whole endeavor. Just to recap, that was the study on the party intervention in Germany, where they took students to a hospital and told them all the bad stuff that happens when you have a severe injury from a traffic accident. They said that previous research found short-term effects, 1 to 2 weeks, on knowledge and attitudes, medium-term effects, 6 to 12 months on self-reported risk behavior, which again, ask your workers 6 to 12 months after training whether they're doing the right thing all the time. Of course they'll say yes. Self-reporting is what it is. Oh, and long-term effects up to 44 months on traffic offenses, injuries, and deaths. 44 months is pretty solid, but I feel like I'd want to dig into that a little further. Anyway, what I promised for this episode was to bring in some studies that support the use of scare tactics. I'm going to try to do that, and we'll go through in rapid-fire fashion like we did the last time. This time, I will try to slow down my speech a little. I realized I kinda sped through those studies last time, and that's not what I want to do when things get super technical, but also really important for everyone to understand. But remember, this whole thing started when I made a claim in the aforementioned ethics course that the lifespan for scare tactics to influence behaviors after training was 30 to 60 days. Now, I know I came up with that number somewhere, so I dug deep into my previous work and I found what I was looking for. So, after I go through these studies, we're going to talk about that. Spoiler alert, I didn't quite remember it correctly. I might have been spreading misinformation for my own interests. So, part of this is going to be the critical evaluation of Dr. Law's potentially false claims. Count yourself fortunate that you get to listen to me put my foot in my own mouth. Get ready for a once-in-a-lifetime experience on the back half of this episode. But, studies first. Everybody ready? Let's go. This first study was published in 2020 by Li, Liu, and Chen in the Health Education Journal. It is titled, Emotions in Fear Appeals, Examining College Students' Attitudes and Behavioral Intentions Towards Colorectal Cancer Prevention in Taiwan. It was funded by the Ministry of Science and Technology of Taiwan. Now, you're going to ask me why we're looking at another public health study instead of workplace safety. We just went over this. If you want to know specifically how scare tactics and workplace safety training are affecting behaviors, you gotta start measuring it. If you remember, in part 1, I had only one study that looked at workplace safety, and that was in Turkey. We've got room for more research here, folks. So this study looks at the extended parallel process model, surprise, surprise, and starts off by pointing out criticisms of the model. Namely, it does not examine the role of emotion and how that influences behavior. Their argument based on previous research, is that the model assumes that fear is the only emotion elicited by fear appeal messages. And the other studies have shown that both fear and anxiety are elicited by fear appeal messages as two separate, discrete emotions. It also seeks to question the proposition that threat and efficacy have a moderating effect on attitudes and behavior. Their argument here is that the model claims that only high threat and high efficacy will result in behavior change. The authors think that the other three groups, high threat, low efficacy, low threat, high efficacy, and low threat, low efficacy, may also cause behavior change just to a different degree. They want to see if there is a significant difference. So they sought to examine emotions and the interaction effects of threat and efficacy to understand their effects on attitudes and behavioral intentions towards colorectal cancer prevention. Now, remember, I'm going through this study from beginning to end, and I have to tell you once again that I'm getting more excited as I do. They start with a pretty thorough literature review where they go through the previous research, and that informs their hypotheses. That's exactly the way it should be done. If you want to hear me rant on constructing hypotheses, go back and listen to the episode on the dreaded C word. So, the first hypothesis is split into two parts. First, fear is elicited by subjects' perceived severity of colorectal cancer. Second, anxiety is elicited by subjects' perceived susceptibility of colorectal cancer. Honestly, that's two different independent variables and two different dependent variables. If I were doing this, I would have actually made that into four separate hypotheses so that you're looking at both severity and susceptibility and their effects on both fear and anxiety. That's okay, I'll give it to them this time. Then they have the second hypothesis split into three parts. First, fear is positively correlated with change in attitudes and behavioral intentions towards colorectal cancer prevention. Second, anxiety is positively correlated with changes in attitudes and behavioral intentions towards colorectal cancer prevention. And third, joy is not related to changes in attitudes or behavioral intentions towards colorectal cancer prevention. So we're also looking at joy now. That's cool. Lastly, they have a well-constructed research question for that final part. Does the high-threat, high-efficacy group achieve the best persuasion effect, while the remaining three groups, high threat, low efficacy, low threat, high efficacy, and low threat, low efficacy, do not differ in regard to the persuasion effect? So let's get into methodology. To develop their messages to be tested, they did a little qualitative research and collected 603 news articles of colorectal cancer. From that, they picked 4 articles for each element in the model: severity, susceptibility, response efficacy, and self-efficacy. They used a focus group to narrow that down to 1 high threat and 1 high efficacy message and 1 low threat and low efficacy message. Then they ran a pilot study with 86 responses to find a significant difference in perceptions across all 4 model elements between the 2 messages. Then they did a pre-test post-test design to measure perceptions among a final sample size of 402 college students. The pretest set the baseline for the perceptions and behavioral intentions, and the post-test, conducted a week later, contained either the high-threat, high-efficacy message or the low-threat, low-efficacy message, split about half and half among those 402 students, and then measured perceptions and behavioral intentions again. Oh, fantastic! They actually quantitatively tested for validity and reliability. This study is good for my soul. Okay, lots of great statistical tests in here, ANOVAs and regression models. Love it. Okay, let's get down to the findings. First, fear had a significant relationship with severity, but did not have a significant relationship with susceptibility. That's interesting. Second, anxiety had a significant relationship with both severity and susceptibility, but it looks like severity affected anxiety more than susceptibility. Furthermore, they found that anxiety had a direct effect on behavioral intentions, but fear did not. Oh boy. Does that mean anxiety is actually what we're after with these scare tactics and not fear? Yes. Anxiety made a positive contribution to adoption of danger control processes, the behavior we want, where they are actually intending to control the hazard. Now, that's behavioral intention. Let's talk about attitudes. This study found that none of the emotions, fear, anxiety, or joy, had any significant effect on attitudes. Instead, it's only perceived threat and perceived efficacy that affect attitudes. So, what they're saying here is that the message itself is the only thing that affects attitudes, whereas either the message or the emotions caused by the message can affect behavior. Speaking of that third emotion, joy, joy also had a positive effect on behavioral intentions. Now, the authors go through this whole discussion on systematic and heuristic processing modes for these different emotions, which I'm not going to fully get into at the moment. But they basically conclude that although both joy and anxiety affect behavioral intention, anxiety is more likely to have a longer lasting effect. They didn't actually test that. That comes from previous research, but they suggest that future research on fear appeals should look deeper into this. That was what I was looking for the whole time. Thanks. Finally, they found that the high threat, high efficacy message had the most persuasion on attitudes and behavioral intentions, followed by high threat, low efficacy, low threat, high efficacy, and low threat, low efficacy had the least persuasion. Perceived threat had more effect on attitudes than perceived efficacy, and perceived efficacy had more effect on behavioral intentions than perceived threat. The authors conclude that the fear appeal approach was effective in changing attitudes and behavioral intentions towards colorectal cancer prevention among college students. However, they say that high threat and high efficacy messages work best, and these messages should elicit an adequate amount of anxiety to be fully effective. So, there it is. 1 point for scare tactics. But again, that point comes with caveats. You can't just go about scaring people willy-nilly. You have to make sure efficacy is part of it. And you should focus on inducing anxiety more than fear. Moving on to the next study. This one, authored by Lang, Ru, and Zhu, was published in Safety Science in 2022. It's titled Risk or Efficacy: How Risk Perception and Efficacy Beliefs Predicted Using Hearing Protection Devices Among Different Groups of Chinese Workers. This study was funded by the National Social Science Foundation in China with no declared competing interests. So, this study actually challenges the extended parallel process model by instead looking at the construal level theory of psychological distance, which suggests that both severity and efficacy may not need to be highlighted simultaneously. So, before we get into the study itself, we need to look at this other theoretical model. So, this construal level theory of psychological distance, or CLT for short, comes from Trope and Lieberman, who have been working on this for decades, apparently. I'll include their 2010 article in the study notes. It's open access. This model illustrates how psychological distance plays a role in decision-making. Basically, there are 4 interrelated dimensions of psychological distance: spatial, social, temporal, and hypothetical. Spatial distance refers to how far the target object is physically removed from the person. Social distance looks at the level of relational closeness and brings in things like a person's view of their behavior, the causal role of other people, etc. Sort of this self-other thing. Temporal distance looks at how distant an event happened or will happen from the present time, and hypothetical distance deals with the level of certainty of an event. Now, it's important to note that these 4 dimensions are not entirely separate, like fear and efficacy are in the other model. Instead, they are often correlational. If you have spatial distance, you probably also have social distance. Bringing this theory into account, the authors wanted to bring in factors such as age and seniority and whether they might have a moderating effect on perceived severity of noise damage, response efficacy, and self-efficacy on hearing protection device usage. They had 6 hypotheses. 1. Age moderates the effect of perceived severity of noise on hearing protection device usage. 2. Seniority moderates the effect of perceived severity of noise. 3. Age moderates the effect of response efficacy on hearing protection device usage. 4. Seniority moderates the effect of response efficacy. 5, age moderates the effect of self-efficacy. And 6, seniority moderates the effect of self-efficacy. Again, repetitive, but this is how good research is done. Also, notice that when you break it down like this, the research becomes very simple. The things we're trying to identify are not that complicated, and they are guided well by the theories we've been discussing. So they did a survey for this, and they got 449 workers from 5 different factories to respond. They also had 46 of those workers stay after the survey for follow-up interviews. That part was to assess their opinions of the hearing protection devices made available to them at the factories, relevant policies, and attitudes of management towards hearing protection. So, I normally don't get into the nitty-gritty of statistics, but I want to explain a little bit of what happened here and why I love regression models so much. They used linear regression to analyze the relationships between variables. The reason why I love linear regression is because not only are you able to see the strength of a correlation, you are also able to calculate variance. What does that mean? At any given time, there are many things that potentially cause something to happen. For example, let's say I want to determine what affects people's decision to eat eggs for breakfast. That decision to eat eggs for breakfast could be affected by age, gender, normal daily diet, the price of eggs, the existence of chronic diseases, the expectations of others to use eggs, the tools available to cook eggs, the amount of sleep the person got the night before, the availability of cereal in the pantry, etc. So, with linear regression, let's say I find a significant correlation between the amount of sleep and the decision to cook eggs. I'll also get this other number that tells me variance, and I'll be able to say that the amount of sleep accounts for 11% of the variance. That means that sleep amounts to 11% of my decision to cook eggs for breakfast, and the other 89% is affected by all of those other potential factors. Do you see where I'm going? This is what gets us a little closer to causation versus correlation. I can't say that the amount of sleep is the exact cause of my decision to cook eggs, but I can say that it is potentially 11% of the cause. Now I have 89% of other things to explore in my research to try to paint the whole picture of causation. Oh, if anybody asks, or if you care, variance is your R-squared number. Oh, and you also get this B coefficient, which tells you the expected or average step change. Now, my decision to cook eggs is a simple no or yes, represented by the numbers 1 and 2 in my statistical analysis. My B coefficient for how sleep affects my decision might be 0.358. That means sleep gets me 0.358 closer from a no to a yes decision to make eggs. This is why I'm obsessed with regression models. They just give a better understanding of the whole picture of the relationship between variables. Okay, back to the study. I'm not going to go through every regression calculation, I promise. I'm sure you might be driving, and I don't want to put you to sleep. I just went on that whole tangent about regression models because I want you to understand why I prefer them, and why it makes me excited about the findings here. First, you may be interested to know that perceived severity, age, their interaction effect, along with all control variables including response efficacy, self-efficacy, and seniority, explained 15% of the total variances in hearing protection device usage. Just think about that for a second. That tells me that all of these things together have an effect, but there are still other factors that play 85% of the role in whether someone uses hearing protection or not. The authors found that age moderated the effect of perceived severity of noise on hearing protection device usage. Basically, younger workers were more affected by perceived severity of noise. They think this is because older workers are the ones who are more likely to be affected by actual problems from noise damage, so they are less affected by the perception and more affected by the reality. Seniority, however, did not moderate the effect between perceived severity and the use of hearing protection. They think this relationship is normalized because of the training received as part of job orientation. They also found that seniority moderated the effect of response efficacy and self-efficacy on hearing protection device usage. More senior workers' decision to use hearing protection was more dependent on efficacy. Basically, more senior workers must have the faith in the effectiveness of hearing protection and exhibit confidence in using it in order for them to actually use it. What are the implications? Messaging targeted at younger workers should highlight severity of noise, and messaging targeted at senior workers should focus on perceived effectiveness of hearing protection and their confidence in using the devices. Additionally, self-efficacy exhibited the strongest effect on hearing protection device usage across all 6 of their regression models compared to other predictors. This is supported by their findings from the follow-up interviews, which highlighted dissatisfaction with the hearing protection devices their employers offered. See, it doesn't matter so much how scared they are. It matters more if you give them the right tools for the job. Wait, Dr. Law, I thought you were giving us studies that supported scare tactics. Well, we sort of got there. Sorry. This is my podcast, so it's going to be a little self-serving. My bad. Okay, now for the moment you've all been waiting for. The desecration of Dr. Law's credibility by digging into his potentially false claims. My claim was that the effects of scare tactics are short-lived, lasting only 30 to 60 days. So where did this number come from? To get this answer, I had to dig back into my previous work, all the way back to 5 or 6 years ago before I ever started really getting into original research, before I ever started my doctoral work, and before I had a true understanding of research to practice, good measurement, and how to fucking write properly. If you've known me long enough, you might know that I have a short presentation series on selling safety. Now, others talk about this, but this series is my own spin based on my own work in learning how to have influential conversations, how to identify the value of safety, and how to align that value with the motivations of organizational stakeholders. That work also turned into my first peer-reviewed article in the Professional Safety Journal in 2020. Now, I stand by this work, but I have to say it was a little painful going back and reading it, knowing what I know now. I've always been a good writer. I'm convinced that my 4.0 GPA associated with my doctoral degree is because my writing was good, not because the content was always good. I may be spewing bullshit, but my grammar and writing style make it believable. Anyway, my 2020 article is included in the episode notes here because this is where I had to start. First, I'm going to admit that I had a little bit of plagiarism here in the form of having a reference in my reference list that I never actually cited in the paper itself. That's a big no-no. If you have something in your reference list, you have to actually have used it in the paper along with some form of proper in-text citation. I probably did this because I had used that reference in my original presentation and I just copied and pasted the reference list from that into my article. That's not a justification. I know I fucked up. But I know better now, and I won't let you use it against me if I ever grade one of your papers. So, in this article, I cited some work by my friend Tim Page-Bottorff. If you work in safety and you don't know that name, you need to learn it. I have a tremendous amount of respect for Tim and his work, and he gives so much back to our profession. So, Tim had published an article in 2016 about creating safety habits. In my paper, I was discussing how selling safety should incorporate more positive conversations and turn away from negative interactions. Here's the quote that I pulled from Tim's article. An OSH team, that's Occupational Safety and Health, cannot intimidate or scare employees into changing their habits. With the average person needing just under 10 weeks to develop a new habit and a sizable minority of employees requiring longer, no single graphic, video, or shocking story will have a consistent impact on their behavior for the length of time required to establish a new routine. Okay, so we have just under 10 weeks to create a habit, but we don't have a number on scare tactics yet. But at this point, I'm almost 100% convinced this is where I got my number. So let's dig into Tim's article a little further and see where he got this. His article is also referenced in the episode notes, but you'll need access to the Professional Safety Journal somehow to read it. Now, Tim's article is a best practices article, so this is one of the articles in PSJ that is not peer reviewed. The reason for this is probably because this article is shorter. It's a snippet of a larger body of work. But he has references, so let's see how deep we can dig. Quoting Tim's article, a common belief is that it takes 21 days to form a new habit. Unfortunately, it is not quite that straightforward, and that statement is missing a few words. One study on changing habits found that it takes a minimum of 21 days to form a new habit. Subsequent research has confirmed that the 21-day mark is often a best-case scenario and that the median time frame for habit formation is 66 days. End quote. So we're going to pause here on Tim and go to the article where he got this information. I promise you, this is important for our discussion, but I won't spend as much time here as I normally do on individual articles. This study by Lally, Van Jaarsveld, Potts, and Wardle was published in the European Journal of Social Psychology in 2010. It's titled, How Are Habits Formed? Modeling Habit Formation in the Real World. They took 96 volunteers and had them choose an eating, drinking, or activity behavior to carry out daily for 12 weeks. They completed the self-report habit index each day and recorded whether they carried out the behavior. The results were able to fit 62 of these participants on a nonlinear regression model, which basically has a curve instead of a straight line, but we don't need to dig too deep into that. So they found that the median time to reach 95% of their asymptote of automaticity, which is a technical way of saying they satisfactorily created a habit, was 66 days. The range, get this, was 18 to 254 days. The difference in this time was not significant based on the type of habit. So what we're taking from this is the median is 66 days to form a habit, but it could take a lot longer for quite a bit of folks. That could explain a little bit of my 30 to 60 days thing. 66 is pretty close. All right, back to Tim's article to grab one more reference. Quote, negative communications, from injury-based scare tactics to old-school yelling, might correct behavior in the moment, but the effect will wear off well before a new habit is formed. Positive thinking has been demonstrated to increase people's ability to build personal skills, and supervisors who take an approach based on encouragement and support will likely promote better habit formation. End quote. From this section, we'll pull one more reference, so let's go to that article. This article, published in 2008 by Fredrickson, Cohn, Coffey, Peck, and Finkel in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, is titled, Open Hearts Build Lives. Positive emotions induced through loving kindness meditation build consequential personal resources. Now this, folks, is not an article I would have clicked on. First of all, it's a little bit on the old side. It's from 2008. My preference is to stick within the last 5 years for the most recent research, unless the work is seminal, meaning it was so influential that it will never not be relevant. Second, it sounds soft and qualitative, and that's not super appealing to me as a quantitative researcher. Nevertheless, we will dig into it, trying not to judge a book by its cover, or an article by its title. Whatever, you get the picture. These folks had a final sample size of 139 participants. They did a pre-test, post-test design, which measured mindfulness and awareness, agency thinking and pathways thinking, savoring beliefs, life orientation, ego resilience, psychological well-being, dyadic adjustment, positive relations with others, illness, sleep, satisfaction with life, and depression. In between the pretest and post-test, they spent 9 weeks completing a short report on their emotions and time spent in meditation, prayer, or solo spiritual activity over the past day. Now, during that 9-week period, half of the participants were put in these workshops once a week, which exercised loving kindness meditation. This meditation helped the participants practice directing love towards themselves, their loved ones, their acquaintances, strangers, and finally to all living beings. They were also given recordings to practice at home. This is probably something I need. Basically, they found that this meditation did not greatly decrease negative emotions, but it greatly increased positive emotions. The increase in positive emotions also helped curb the impacts of negative emotions like depression. They were able to build the resources that make their lives more fulfilling and help keep their depressive symptoms at bay. So, this study gives us a little ammunition to say that giving people positive interactions and giving them something to believe in is actually a tool in itself to help them be more successful. To be honest, we might have to have another episode that digs into the impact of positive reinforcement as opposed to the impact of scare tactics. All right, now, I have brought all of this to you to say that I have been spreading a little bit of misinformation. My claims about the effects of scare tactics to influence behavior lasting only 30 to 60 days were not entirely true. However, I think we still learned some things. Let me list them out. 1. Theoretically, scare tactics can work. But 2. You have to make sure they sufficiently induce both perceived severity of the hazard and perceived susceptibility of the hazard. 3. You have to make sure the person has efficacy, meaning they feel like what you're telling them to do will actually work, and they have the ability to do what you're telling them to do, which also means that you have to give them the right tools to do the job. 4. If you do happen to induce fear but fail to ensure efficacy, you can exacerbate the problem. A fear control response will occur instead of a danger control response. The person may avoid the task altogether instead of controlling the hazard to work safely. Trust me, you, as the safety professional, do not want to be the reason your workers aren't working. 5. The effects of scare tactics may have a time limit. However, we don't know exactly what that time limit is. The time limit is probably dependent on how long the efficacy lasts, and efficacy is affected by many things. So it's a little fragile and a lot to maintain. 6. On the emotions you're trying to induce for scare tactics to be effective, you may have to focus more on inducing anxiety rather than fear. 7. If you use scare tactics, you may have to tailor the message based on factors like age and seniority. 8. If you use scare tactics, you sure as hell better make sure it's legal and that you consider the ethics around what you're doing. 9. Positive messaging may be more effective, but we need to do a little bit more research on that to really know. 10. I still don't understand what the hell a multimodal discourse analysis is. And finally, 11. It is entirely possible to dig through my previous work and poke holes in it. Dr. Law is not immune to critical feedback. And that, my friends, is all I have time for today. I hope that you've enjoyed part 2 of my discussion on scare tactics in workplace safety training. Until next time, I'm Dr. Matt Law. This has been another episode of Study Finds on the Prove It To Me podcast. Take care and stay safe, everyone. Prove It To Me is produced by me, Matt Law. Original music by Wes London. You can find this podcast on Podbean, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon Music, and iHeartRadio. Like what you've heard so far? Please like, subscribe, and follow wherever you get your podcasts. And leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Got questions about what we talked about or research that you want to share? Send an email to contact@proveitpod.com. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the host and its guests and do not necessarily represent the official position, opinion, or strategies of their employers or companies. Examples of research and data analysis discussed within this podcast are only examples. They should not be utilized in the real world as the only solution available, as they are based on very limited, often single use case, and sometimes dated information. Assumptions made within this discussion about research and data analyses are not necessarily representative of the position of the host, the guests, or their employers or companies. No part of this podcast may be reproduced, stored in a retrieval system, or transmitted in any form or by any means, mechanical, electronic, recording, or otherwise, without prior written permission of the creator of the podcast. The presentation of the content by the guests does not necessarily constitute an active endorsement of the content by the host.